I'm Vincent Zimmer. I work with Intel, and I'm going to give you guys an update on UEFI networking and security. I'm hoping this is more informal, open discussion, so I'll go quickly through some of the formal material to save time for Q&A. I was going to wear my hoodie and try to make a Mr. Robot joke, but Brian told me, how would I know who was giving the presentation? So I'm going to stick to just me and the PowerPoint here. Since I work a lot with you guys in the networking security sub-team, what I wanted to do, folks who may not be in the sub-team, sort of give an overview of where we're at right now. So what have we done? Where is the Eagle landed? And then where we're going. Where's the Eagle trying to land? Some of the challenges we have in this area, at least a few that I could think of, but would definitely like to get feedback from others. And then any questions. Should we be doing more of certain things, less, and have that as somewhat of an open discussion during the Q&A. So to begin, where are we now? Pretty excited, actually. We've shipped stuff, we've published specs, dance, right? So it's good. So let's talk about where we are now. So the latest UEFI specs, 2.6, 6.1, the shell, PI14, packaging. A lot of these specifications have security content, most notably the UEFI main specification. The first feature is Secure Boot. So you guys recall what Secure Boot's all about, having the root of trust in the platform. I showed the Windows boot flow here, but the same boot flow you could have on Linux with shim or a Linux-based operating system like Android. I believe their UEFI loader is called Kernel Flinger. So again, Secure Boot, our root of trust, and most notably, it's we've been evolving it. The original 1 and 2, 3, and we've added DBT after that, and then we've changed, augmented with some of the enterprise deployment we'll talk about. And along with the specification, we've been trying to keep open source implementation on Tiano Core, and we've moved to GitHub as Brian, Leaf, and others talked about yesterday. The other feature that's sort of not on the trunk yet, but showed up in 2.5 is the customized Secure Boot. I think Scott Anderson yesterday mentioned the baby duck. If you guys ever read the paper by Ross Anderson about the resurrecting duckling, it's really the metaphor, or the analogy, I guess, is to a duck, the first animal it sees, it thinks is its mother, it imprints against. That's really what some of the enterprise deployment is all about. Having additional state of the machine for provisioning, testing your Secure Boot environment before actually going into user mode. One of the notable things, and I'll talk a little bit about the process at the end, is if you look at the URL, it's not the trunk. This is an instance of the staging tree, and in fact, this feature is one of the features that motivated the creation of the staging tree. So we have always had the challenge in the forum. We'd write a spec, we open source code, and then operating systems and pre-OS ISVs, OEMs start porting. And when they port, you write OS tests, you do scenarios, and you may find compatibility issues. We go back, we write ECRs, we change the spec. When the spec goes live, we can change the code. But the problem is that day 0, when we put the first code out there, through which we started interoperating, if people snap that code, put it in products, if we subsequently fix the code, there may be a lot of errant or non-conformant implementations. So what we're trying to do with the staging tree is this. We want to be open source. We want to interoperate with all of the ecosystem. But by not being on the trunk, we're effectively saying, hey, OS guys, OEMs, let's start doing our use cases, workflows, interoperability. Find issues, go back to the forum with ECRs, errata, fix it on staging, and then once we've published the confidence that we have some degree of interoperability testing, we put it on the trunk. So we can be open for interoperability, but we don't give people the impression that we're done. And so that's kind of the idea of staging here. Is this feature specifically, there's the whole state machine about user mode, setup mode, audit, deployed. Should you do a reset here or not here? How does this compose with other industry specs? Since there have been some opens, we want to sort of allow for the code to be out there that we can work together, but at the same time work those opens. So that's some of the gist behind staging, and this is one subscriber to the staging tree. Another thing, secure firmware update. So essentially have the ability to do the capsule-based update, publish the ESRT, align with FMP. I didn't put a URL here because a lot of the patches we've put for a full, a complete capsule update scenario, rollback protection, the patches were just sent out, I think a couple days ago. And so they're not on the upstream yet. They may go to staging, but again, what we want to do is have full implementations so people can audit, review, interoperate with the operating system community. So secure firmware update is one of our pillars. Another is boot recovery. This one is a little less, thanks Peter Jones, the inventor, sitting in the back. So what boot recovery is all about is, our boot options today are circa 1998 EFI 1.0 spec. They're mutable, there's no administrative control. And a lot of people do recovery today is they recompose the boot options. They have one boot option, maybe the first is their pre-boot authenticator, their disk encryption, the second can be their primary OS, and their third boot option may be the recovery OS. The problem with that is if malware goes after your system and deletes your boot options, you've lost that third boot option. So the intent behind recovery is to have some more hardened, access-controlled boot options and have recovery as a more stylized flow. This is another example where we published the spec, there were some interpretation issues, and since we weren't comfortable or ready to put the spec or to put the code out on even staging because we're working through that feedback, a new concept we have, which I'll talk a little bit at the end from a process perspective, is UEFI Proto. Again, the idea here is spec and code evolve. We want a degree of transparency, but we also want to respect the IP rules of the UEFI Forum that if there's a change that's not reflected in the public spec, can we have code that's just available to members as any pre-publication material. But boot recovery, another big security feature that's come since we've last given an update here. And then, since I'm wearing the two hats of the networking and security subteam, I wanted to just let you guys know we have the full HTTP stack, HTTP boot scenario, and our friend staging tree is back for TLS. So why do we have TLS on staging? Well, some of the issues we're working through are how to provision and manage certificates. Again, keep it off the trunk so people don't have the presumption that we've solved all those issues, but at the same time we want to work with the OS and the pre-OS ISVs, OEMs on getting this feature ready. So we have the generic networking capabilities in the network package and then the TLS variants on staging, and we're closing all the opens to try to get it off staging. So we have our HTTP stack and then of course the HTTP boot, which is the scenario. Where we're going, I wanted to set a little context on how the working groups operate. So we have the main working groups for the ACPI spec working group, the PI working group, the board, and then the network and security subteam. So the real reason we have the subteams are, as we evolve in, proposals in more detail, the main working group has to cover the full spectrum of capabilities, where the subteams can spend weeks on detailed proposals, back and forths. And so this is the place we sort of incubate, evolve, onboard new topics. And so it serves a key role as advice and consent to the main working groups, but by themselves don't really have main voting power. I think great collaboration with a lot of people in the room and folks that aren't here in the past, and I think this sort of dynamic of advice and consent and drilling deeper, we can even do more. So this is sort of sets the tone for where are we going, some of the recommendations I have. And then the other thing I wanted to set the tone is how we've been evolving spec and code historically. We grandfathered in the EFI 110 specification, the framework specs, until framework specs became the PI, EFI sample became the EDK1 and then the EDK2. So what I want to talk about here is how we've had precursors to what became the main specs that were in the open and then contributed. And I think that model of having things in the open as a life cycle and becoming part of the standards is a virtuous cycle we can do more of. And so what do we do today? So I have to confess I'm not as diligent as most folks, and I do my PowerPoint at the last minute, so if I have any bugs in here, I apologize. So for example, I mistyped the title. So what we do today is proposals. We have new content. It's a closed process. You write an ECR. We create the spec. That's a closed process. We open the spec up. We finally become open. Implementations. A lot of practices today are we take the spec, people sit in their office, write code, post it when they're quote unquote done. So a lot of implementation creation is done closed, but then opened once it's quote done. Test creation, a similar dynamic of closed and then opened. And then bugs, we do security bugs closed. And so I think this is great stuff, but you'll notice a serialization of spec before code, and then not a lot of transparency in how code and the specs are evolving. So what could we do different? And so this is sort of just to sort of propose maybe a different way, we can engage going forward. So one thing you can do is if you have a design proposal or an idea, nothing really stops you from not doing that in the open. Maybe you have a protocol. We have an example of this, our variable EX, where we put it out in the open. Show people what you're thinking. It's your idea. You just want to share. And then you can take that. You have an artifact. You built something. You write an ECR. You go closed again. So the first one can be open. The second one is closed. But as the ECR evolves, working with other members of, say, the sub-team and the main working group, they give you feedback. That's awesome. But that open artifact in step 1 becomes closed in step 2. And that's where UEFI Proto, where we have a UEFI Forum GitHub, we can do some development together. At the same time, write a rationale. A lot of the best ECRs, and I encourage people I work with in the network subteam to write a great rationale. So when we write an ECR, we say background, rationale, and then the formal proposal. Tell people why. And I think there's a lot of features like recovery, enterprise deployment, great rationales. And I think the rationale can be used forward-looking. Specifically in step 3, we've sort of fed back ECR code in step 2. We like it. We went to the main working group. We published a spec. We're much closer to having code at that point. Code in UEFI Proto can go back to the dev tree, to staging, or the trunk. Close that time gap between that closed part of 2 and 3, and then write about what the ECR did. Today our specifications are very prescriptive, formal. We've been told to not have informative content. I think this harkens back to the days of POSIX specs where keep it clean and just to the main spec. And the why and rationale were intended for design guides or companion documents. We perhaps don't have as many of those companion design guides as we do formal specification. So if in the process, a lot of folks write some good stuff in ECRs, their rationale, turn that into public matter we can share with people. And then if you had code earlier that was EDK2 lexically scoped, your spec, once it's codified in the spec, you then can have the EFI prefix on your protocols and data structures. So this is just some thoughts on maybe how we can do things differently, trying to practice what we preach on a few features. Since those features are not public yet, I can't, in a venue like this that's going to publish what we talk about, name them, but folks who are involved know. And I think we could do more of this going forward, where we spec and code and rationale document co-designed with the ECR. And then putting it all together, that's great. So let's close that gap, semantic gap between spec and code and the time lag between when a spec goes live and when we see the bits. I think more platforms. So OVMF, Minnow, some of the, I know the ARM guys, ecosystem has 96 boards. Open platforms where you can grab, land these trees. Hopefully the platform code's upstreamed on EDK2, but to be honest, it's upstream somewhere where people reading the spec, taking core elements, can actually put it all together. Because one of the challenges we have is, I got an email recently from friends on the East Coast that said, NIST 800 147 just hit ISO. Where is the EFI chapter on 147? I said, EFI is an interface spec. The EFI Forum doesn't say how to build things. We don't have the protection profile for the UEFI 2.6, right? We're Legos, we're building blocks, we're interfaces that are composable. But there are a lot of Legos and there are a lot of ways to compose them based on market and business requirements. So I think one value of having open platform implementations is you can demonstrate some compositions, and in those demonstrations you can say, hey, like that capsule update example, we think we got a 147 based example. Just like today, if you read a Windows logo or an Android CDD, are prescriptive on these things. We can have real instantiations of specs. And I think this is something that will help us as we evolve. And then bugs. I think Brian and Leaf talked a little bit yesterday about security bugs. We have the ability now for EDK2 specific ones to go directly to secure GitHub, or excuse me, secure Bugzilla. But I think the USRT is eminently important still. You can still report there. Spec issues definitely need to go there. Other ecosystem security issues. And then another thing, so we build pieces, we build the Legos, but how to use them. You know, an end user, you tell them, hey, I got the new HTTP helper protocol. An IT guy is going to probably shrug his shoulders. So more of these scenarios, like for HTTP, we have in wireless recovery, what's the end user use case? Showing how you can actually use these components maybe on these reference platforms, maybe our OS vendors and ISVs, upstreaming some examples to show how to put these things together. Part of the rationale for some of these ECRs, talking more about these scenarios. And then you can see the crossover. So for updates, I think we did a great job with Capsule. We have the network stack. I suspect you don't want me to talk anymore about REST and Redfish. I'm just saying they exist. After Wednesday or Tuesday, you guys got such a deep review. But how do they compose with other standards? So if the DMTF guys want to push stuff from the outside, out of band, we push things through the host. Whether this goes into the main spec or are things we document, how you can have these sort of end-to-end scenarios on update. And then other use cases like iPXE. So one of the reasons we did HTTP was originally HTTP boot was we heard the data center guys loved iPXE, provisioning across, you know, the continent between proofs of presence on dark fiber. TFTP was out of gas, so we modeled some of our capabilities on what iPXE had. iPXE also has scripting. You know, could we evolve the Lego pieces in the shell to help with that use case in that scenario? So think about scenarios a little more. This is what ultimately brings value to the customers. I think it's implicit in a lot of us. Maybe writing it down and socializing it more as we evolve, though, helps with the business rationale, too. And then helps sort of us connect with the IT guys above us, who the low-level Lego pieces, they're cool, but you know, we have a communication gap. So I think scenarios can help there. So writing down more. So we all have day jobs, and we're all challenged doing our day jobs and our contribution to the UEFI Forum. I think I said at the beginning of, we were in a meeting, and I said to Dong, that's why they pay you guys the big bucks. He's had some issue, he's working as the president. But what big bucks does the forum pay? It pays no bucks. So we don't have lots of time, right? But I think writing down more will help us. Like the enterprise deployment, a colleague of mine who works on Android read the spec and said, this stuff's crazy, why would you ever do this? We have a draft rationale document. He read it and he said, I get it. So I think it really will help writing down more, and I think we are doing it. But like I said, the way we do standards here in the UEFI Forum, you know, we're not like the TCG that does the informative comments. We really need to write these companion documents. And from experience, I understand why people don't do the informative, because people treat the informative as the spec, and you know, mixing the two is hard. So I think writing down more is a challenge because we all have day jobs and a lot of work to do, but I think it will help us. And then the more to do that I was really signing up for is documenting some of those workflows more, like the TLS. What's our certificate handling solution and provisioning? We're thinking of using the KMS protocol, which really wasn't for this use case, but as a way to compose two pieces that formerly weren't used together before. And then get some of the, to me, emancipate the ECRs, that informative content that was so great that we really haven't published before. And we have the enterprise deployment paper in draft review. We have a second one on wireless. If James Bottomley were here, he constantly rebukes me that we haven't written a trust boundary document. Think of the rationale for that. Mock and the Linux guys put their database in boot service variables, and so they have an implicit access control model that boot service variables are safer than OS visible. We really haven't written that down. So writing things like that down. And others, would like to hear from you guys, whether not in front of your 50 best friends, maybe you don't want to raise your hand, but join the working group or privately. Talk about others you think we really should spend some of our energy on. And open up more codes, like defense in depth. We talk a lot about stack protection, randomization. You really can't codify in the UEFI spec. You talk to a few folks, yeah, this idea is good, oh, there's not enough entropy. One way we can break those log jams is sort of put the code out there and start talking as a community, whether it's UEFI Proto or Developer GitHub. That's something definitely, at least on our side, we're going to try to do more of. And in the next bullet also, embrace the community more on testing. Things like AFL, great fuzzers, they're jamming on Windows binaries. A lot of people haven't adapted them to pre-OS. Maybe there's some value there. And then chipsec with its extensibility. Have more of that. That's something I think the security sub-team can help drive going forward. Because assurance is one of our big challenges. And here's the lots of information. So we have some white papers. They're in PDF. You heard yesterday PDFs aren't great. Gitbooks, live docs would be better. But to me, that's like talking about paper plates versus China, versus not having anything. So to me, not having anything to eat on, we're moving to paper plates. In the future, we'll have more live, literate code and docs, but right now we have a lot of PDFs, but I want to give you guys pointers to that. And we've been trying to curate a lot for our implementation because our variable driver S3, as you guys may or may not know, are not the simplest pieces of code, and would like to see the set of documents on the spec, those companion documents, rationale docs, meet or exceed the number we've done on the implementation. And getting connected, sign up on the mailing list, join the forum, join the sub-team. You can reach out to me directly. I have to add an addendum to Brian yesterday that said, don't send email security bugs. These two people specifically, don't give me security bugs on Twitter either. That's uncomfortable. I just don't know what to do. But get connected. And with that, I'm going to pause for my last 0 to 6 minutes for questions. I think we can. We can dumpster dive into the ECRs. Excuse me. We can research the old ECRs and pull out the content. Sure. Yeah. Most definitely. And what I would actually like to hear from the community here. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question from Charles at ARM is, why can't, for published specifications, why can't we retroactively go back and create rationale documents? I believe we can. And what I would like to hear from folks like you and others is, which ones would you prioritize? Which features are your customers constantly calling? And to me, it's if you answer the same email 12 times, it tells you something's wrong, right? Yeah. It needs to be written down. So if you guys have feedback, I'd love to hear, whether here now or in the sub-team or, yeah, I think it's just that putting it on the priority queue. Enterprise deployment, definitely one that sticks out, but to be frank, we get a lot of secure boot questions in some of our rationale. Not well defined. Our variables, because of some implicit access control models, is probably a high one. So yeah, just want to hear.